welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore, joined by the Riverstyx team. Super excited. Miriam Volat and Cody Swift. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks, Joe.
Happy to be here, Joe. Thank you.
Super psyched to have you both. So I guess to kick it off, you've both been on the show before. We've talked about IPCI, the amazing Peyote initiative, and Riverstyx. But for those who haven't listened to those episodes, Cody, Miriam, I'm wondering if you could just give us a picture of Riverstyx. Like, what is Riverstyx? What do y'all do?
I can jump in here. Riverstyx is a charitable foundation, and Miriam and I are both co-directors of that. We've been operating for about 14 years, and I think high level, we really try to fund projects, initiatives, people that are least able to get funding from other traditional funding sources because of the stigmatized nature of those projects. And so early on, that led us into a lot of drug policy reform, drug decriminalization efforts, criminal justice, but first and foremost has been leading the psychedelic research funding effort. So over about the last 14 years, we've probably invested near $10 million in the research effort, and that's all nonprofit. And so we really try to stay, I would say, on that leading edge of really what is needed next. And we're not attached to needing to stay on any one area. So even with the psychedelic effort, about 7 years ago, I really felt a shift happen culturally and in the field, and there were new funders coming to the table and really stepping up. Carrie Turnbull, Bill Linton, others who were really seeming to hold that in a new way. Bill Linton sort of transitioning Hefter into his own company, Usona. And I felt like there was still a need for us in the psychedelic space, but that it would be different. And no longer were we needed as perhaps the driver of this research anymore, and really providing the funds to drive the research forward. And that's really proven out with all this for-profit capital that's flooded in. And we've really started to pivot to a very different role of, instead of being the gas, so to speak, to really helping to build in systems of integrity and to make sure that the psychedelic space has the values and integrity in place such that the whole field can be sustainable and aligned with its initial core intentions of healing. And so a big part of that has been our Indigenous medicine work, Miriam joining the board, the B Corp of MAPS, and really driving that conversation around equity and equal access, and really advocating for minority populations. Also really concerned about potential harms around psychedelics, and that there are real concerns and real risks. And I think there's been so much enthusiasm that's really driven us to where we are. And I don't think there's been enough space to really talk about the potential risks psychologically or sexually, as we're seeing now too. And we see that there are people who are coming to the table wanting to introduce that conversation in a very inflammatory way, really sort of creating divides in the community. And we would like to be able to hold space where those conversations can be had with rigor and scientific rigor, and really looking at the research and understanding phenomenologically what does go wrong in the session rooms. Even in top tier universities, what can go wrong there, and what are the interventions that need to be put in place to ensure safety, as this again leaves the universities, like it did in the 50s, and goes sort of mainstream, quote unquote, with the Oregon initiative taking off and decrim. So, just on a high level, I think that's really kind of our evolution, is really shifting from kind of helping to drive the research forward to now ensuring that things are tended to with that continuity of integrity and intention of healing.
Nerdy question, but I feel like it's essential. But Riverstyx, can you explain the name a little bit for folks?
Yeah, and I'll honor my father who actually came up with the name, and he and I, when I was a little boy, he always read me Greek mythology, so it was something that we really connected on. And so he named it, but it took me probably 10 years to sort of tie it into the to the mission. The Riverstyx was, in Greek mythology, the transition point which carried souls after they died, after people died, into the afterlife. And so it's this real point of transition from the world above and the world below, between light and the shadow. And we kind of regard ourselves working at that intersection, really trying to connect the shadow realms, that which doesn't want to be looked at or funded, and really bringing a credence and bringing a kind of authentic conversation that people can warm up to and be able to look at socially, and bringing merit to those conversations. And it's sort of become a guiding philosophy that's really worked for us as a foundation to find places where other funders aren't funding. And it seems to be a real point of great healing. And it just proves out psychologically that what creates most pathology is that which we repress. And so much of psychological healing is just bringing that repressed material to consciousness and making relationship to it, making healthy relationship to it. And that's exactly how psychedelics work, I think, in their best sense, clinically.
Was there anything about end of life work you were working on, or like green funerals or something like that, maybe?
Yeah, so death and dying has been kind of at the forefront of our effort, and was the lead-in actually to us getting involved in psychedelics in the first place. And coming across an article, or it was a quote really, by Reverend Mike Young, who was a reverend in Honolulu, who was actually one of the participants in the Good Friday experiment.
Oh, wow.
And he was reflecting on his experience decades later, and he said, why psilocybin and psychedelics are so effective for end of life and for cancer patients is because when we face the end of life, we're so attached to all of our identities and our roles and all the things that are stripped away from us. And psychedelics give us that chance of letting go of those attachments before we die, and experiencing ourself and experiencing our reality beyond those attachments. Um, and so that inspired me so much, that led me to Johns Hopkins and Roland's research, and we funded the cancer anxiety trial there. And then I did a qualitative paper, which I might refer you to. It's called Cancer at the Dinner Table, and it really looks at the phenomenology of how people are healing in the face of cancer and death. How they're actually reconciling those very difficult parts. But we're also, not just in the psychedelic realm, but we made I think our largest and our first big impact investment with our impact investment advisor, Kevin Bayuk, in a company called Recompose. And they're trying to bring human decomposition at scale, and in a very efficient way, returning bodies to basically to soil within a month time, and helping to reinstill this psychological reconnection to the cycles of life and death, and not cutting that off with a very finite conception of death that's really sort of baked into cremation and to embalming and conventional funerals.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love it. That's actually really encouraging you did that. Wow. So Miriam, can you talk a little bit about your work and your time with Riverstyx?
Sure. Yeah, I think my background and training is a lot as an ecologist. And, you heard the way that Cody was talking about sort of being in relationship with these parts of yourself, society, or your psyche that have been kind of stigmatized or pushed down. And so, from an ecological perspective, everything is about relationships, right? And interrelationships. And when you have a relationship in one place, it affects relationships in other places. And so, um, I really see, a lot of what we're doing right now at this time is tending kind of right relationship or healthy relationship, or relationship that's about learning and exchange with some parts of society that have been, either ignored or traumatized by being in relationship with dominant culture, right? And so I came on to Riverstyx really fortunately by meeting Cody actually through my work as a soil scientist with legalizing and making more accessible composting toilets. So that, in the face of climate change and climate weirding, we could change our relationship with what we do with our waste, not put it in water, which is a precious part of our
Especially in
world,
California.
especially in California, and actually put our waste back into the cycle of feeding the rest of the ecosystem in a really healthy way, and reducing our energy use and just lowering our footprint in terms of our impact on what our climate and what our planet needs to absorb. And so that was kind of how we met. And in some ways, I feel like it's just a perfect Riverstyx endeavor, one that we're still really interested in supporting. Some of the research has been slowed down because of COVID, but it's something we have a commitment to. And it's sort of a strange jump to say this, but also this relationship with really supporting the Native American church on their terms with what they really needed has a similarity in that it's a part of society that mainstream society has, and has damaged historically, especially in the United States, but other places in the Americas as well. And so we really entered, like Cody said, he heard that this issue for Native Americans was around the supply of their medicine, which was being really damaged, not only by land practices, lack of ability to access land directly, but also by the way that the DEA was regulating it. It removed them from having the capacity to ensure the health of the sacred land where their medicine grows. And so we've really been on this, I would call it a learning journey of how to do that support in really right relationship. And a lot of what we've learned from that is listening, taking sort of instruction about what kind of support is needed and how to support, whether it's financially or other kinds of capacity building or other kinds of connections from leadership in those communities. And as we went more into that, we also started working with an organization called ICPI and learning more about similar situations that were happening in other parts of the world with other biocultures. And we now call them biocultures because, and that's an ecological term, but we've learned so much that, people's territory, plants, the structures around that hold a way of life together, all of these things are really inextricable. And so we started learning that other biocultures, like those around iboga or those around Zappo toad, or those around even ayahuasca, but in a different way, had similar kinds of issues to peyote communities, to peyote bioculture, territory issues, pressure, not just from environmental pressures and like sort of extractive industry pressures, but also pressures were growing because of the increased interest in like plant medicines in the psychedelic space. And not just pressures on the plant, although those were very much there, but also just pressures on leadership's time and culture and trying to understand what was happening and the creation of concern. So we support an assessment, biocultural assessment and sustainability assessment on iboga. And we also supported some assessment work in the Amazon in some different communities. And really, I think inspired by our work with peyote about how complex and how important and how crucial that work was, we realized that there were really other biocultures that were in immediate need of support at scale.
And really quick, two questions. Can you kind of lay out what a loose definition of a bioculture, and then I'd really love to briefly hear just high level what you found about iboga.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So bioculture, kind of like I was saying, we're using that term now because sometimes, like in the in the psychedelic space, sometimes people are just focused on this organism or brew or something, and that's the focus. But really, for thousands of years, those things aren't separated from a way of life or a cultural container that guides many things through a territory, through language. And so that's why we're really using that term bioculture, so as not to kind of dissect these things into little parts that are actually very interconnected.
So something like a ayahuasca bioculture, something like that.
Yeah.
And kind of is inclusive of a lot of the First Nations using that, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
You got it. And then, so iboga is a great one. What we found working with ICPI to look at what was happening in Gabon in the traditional iboga using communities was that iboga indeed over the 10 years that its use has gone up to directly address opioid use for folks mostly in Mexico, for a lot of vets, and it's been just this incredible blessing. Also in Canada it got used a lot, is that the native populations and the places where locals were used to going to get that for their initiatory ceremonies were actually already dramatically over harvested, and people were having to walk farther. People were very concerned about the future of the medicine. So when we learned about that with iboga, and then we also learned with supporting some of the ayahuasca projects, we had one particular project that we began a relationship with called UMIAC, which was the United Medics of Yahe of Colombia, which is 5 different tribes coming together to protect their territories. was that there were requests and people were asking not just for more funding, but also for support mediating between the communities and funders and other people, that sometimes those direct connections were actually causing real problems in the communities. So we were hearing this request. So and then, of course, holding the story that we all know of Maria Sabina and the level of, just dramatic cultural destruction and harm that was done through, not unintentionally, right, by interests in the psilocybin mushrooms. And so, and I think that's a lot of how we're looking at this is there can be a lot of unintended consequences from this quest for healing, for addressing mental health crisis, for addressing, disconnection from each other, for addressing disconnection from nature, all of the things that we hope for from the psychedelic space, addressing addiction, all of that. But what are some of those unintended consequences, and what is our role, and where are the key places where we can, ease that and support really right relationship between some of these stakeholders, sectors, whatever word you want to use, so that we learn from lessons of the past and don't perpetrate harm in these places. And so I think our commitment to supporting Indigenous medicine conservation has just continued to deepen, and we see it as one of those places where there could be a lot of unintended harm, and what can we do to support that not happening. So along
Have you
with
done any work with like the Nagoya protocol around biopiracy and whatnot?
Absolutely. So we have supported the creation of an Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund, which represents 5 biocultures: peyote, ayahuasca, iboga, Zappo toad, even though that's a little bit different, and also mushroom, at least in the Mexican context. And the Nagoya protocols and the biodiversity protocols impact a lot of those medicines directly. Mexico is a signer. There's 176 signers, countries that are signers. And basically what those protocols ask for, and these requests were developed over 35 years with hundreds and hundreds of interviews through a United Nations process, is that when biological heritage molecules are being used to benefit, like either a business or even in an art context, that the ethical and appropriate and Indigenous rights-based approach is to do benefit sharing. They also recommend to do consent. Consent obviously is a lot harder than benefit sharing. So we're doing a number of things. One is when we work with funders, we're supporting them to understand these protocols and do their best to live up to honoring them, and giving them vehicles for being able to do that. So one of the things like an Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund can do is it can be a vehicle for doing benefit sharing into communities without doing harm in the communities. And then the other piece around is that we're actually working in the communities and doing series of workshops for folks, and then supporting Indigenous communities themselves to understand their rights under these protocols and be able to call upon their governments, if they're signers, to actually have a well-done regulatory framework, to have vehicles for being able to receive benefit sharing. And so I know that was all very wordy, but those protocols are one of the things that our Indigenous partners have asked for support to understand how to utilize. And then we created this Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund, which we can talk about a little bit more if you're interested, but that is a vehicle for being able to do benefit sharing, not just from the psychedelic space, also from the climate space. We're finding more and more. One of our first big funders was actually somebody who really, really cares about conservation and heard about what was happening with Iboga and the relationship between Iboga and the jungles of Western Africa and the elephants. So places where Iboga is poached are the same places where elephants are poached. And elephants and Iboga actually have a ancient relationship. The Pygmies were taught how to use Iboga from the elephants, and then the Pygmies taught the Bantu and other groups that use it. And so their conservation is intertwined, elephants and Iboga, and the people who rely on it. And so with the fund, we really are not just doing financial support, but support like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I think just the fact that we have this thing called the Nagoya Protocol that's been really well developed, and people aren't discussing it explicitly. It seems like, we found a toy and then we just shake it around like, oh, look, biopiracy. But like, hey, look, there's a whole history here and there's people working on it, and like, we can be part of this project. And I think, I applaud your work there. It's super helpful to know that,
Well,
you are working on this.
Yeah, it's such an incredible opportunity. Like Cody said it this way one time, and it's so true. It's become, part of the ethic of how this fund is being created. But it's like, I'm paraphrasing, but how can we be working on, addressing this mental health crisis and relieving big amounts of people from, trauma, PTSD, addiction, all of that, and not really consider how to address huge communities that are of incredible importance to the biocultural diversity of our future, to the climate mitigation of our future, because they're on that land. And also they've been, carrying and stewarding these medicines for thousands and thousands of years. Like, how can we not also attend to that in a really good way and support their healthy future the way that they want it to be supported?
Yeah, that's interesting. Cody, anything you want to add around Nagoya?
Well, not necessarily Nagoya, but I do want to just riff off of what Miriam was saying, and one of the challenges and really the kind of the gifts of the fund is creating a trusted vehicle for funders to be able to give back to Indigenous communities, and creating that trusted partnership both with funders but also with people on the ground. And so it's a conduit, and we've done 7 years of building relationship with Indigenous peoples and leadership of the Native American Church in the United States. And ICEERS has had even longer building these relationships with ayahuasca communities and also Iboga. And through this long history of building relationships, we really want to try to make that available to philanthropists and also for-profit companies alike who want to build in reciprocity in their business ethic or in their philanthropy. And even if the U.S. is not a signer of the Nagoya Protocol, that these companies can still take a stand and take leadership and build that in as a primary ethic in this field. One of the challenges, though, that we're finding, and I'm wanting to be vulnerable here, is that we struggle with narratives of why it's important to give back to these communities in the first place. And I think psychologically that shame, I think, gets in the way. The shame of largely what our European ancestors, how they interfaced with Indigenous communities when they came to the New World, and I think some resistance to the sense of kind of obligation for to be sort of woke, or the obligation to sort of be politically correct and taking the stand. But I think that all gets in the way of what the reality is that when Europeans came to the New World, over 90% of the indigenous communities were wiped out from disease and warfare, and we think that's in the past, but these communities are they're still fighting to survive. They're still fighting to maintain their cultural identity, their language. And unless you've really spent time with these communities, it's hard to appreciate what it's like to be sitting down with them over a meal, or even in a ceremonial context, and hearing the diversity of language, and just the preciousness of there being a completely different cultural framework and paradigms for living and communing and raising children, that these cultures are truly precious. And people fly all over the world to see exotic cultures, and here, right in our neighborhoods, there are people who are fighting to keep their language alive. And that it's just such the case that for the Native Americans in the United States, that peyote actually has played a truly and a non-trivial role in that cultural survival. That peyote came to them at a time of peak cultural crisis and has been supporting them quietly for over 150 years in the United States, to heal through all these traumas, giving them a safe place and container to be able to process all the loss and the challenges they face, and that a lot of these cultural pieces were really baked into the ceremony. So the ceremony itself is like a vehicle for carrying forth a lot of the ancient cultural threads. And so, a lot of people don't want to name this of why it's important to give back, but I just wanted to give space here of that this is about cultural survival, and that we as a psychedelic community are so enthusiastic about their healing potential, but why aren't we getting behind supporting Native American communities in their sustainability of their medicines that they rely on for that healing? So that's what really kind of drove us to this big commitment to IPCI, and also by extension of the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund, where we're in this first phase setting out to raise $20 million, which seems like a lot of money, but when broken out in between these keystone biocultural medicines, really is not a lot. And we feel like we're using this in a very efficient way. In Texas, we bought 600 acres of land and are in communication with other ranchers to lease many thousands more acres to be able to do sustainable harvesting. Miriam has worked tirelessly interfacing with the DEA, actually, who has been receptive to our request to have a research nursery, to begin researching propagation, raising medicine and propagating it into the field as a sustainability strategy. And she can say more about that, but that's been a huge success, and maybe a real turnkey in this question of long-term sustainable viability of the species and the culture.
Beautiful. Yeah, Miriam, I don't usually have people say good things about the DEA on the show, but I'd really love to know about your process of working with the DEA to help get this kind of status.
Well, the DEA, under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, has the responsibility to regulate the legal use of peyote for bona fide ceremonial purposes by federally recognized tribes in the United States. And so the board of the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative has decided that it's good to maintain good relations with them. And so, like Cody said, there's now a nursery in South Texas for doing regeneration of overharvested areas and improperly plowed areas. And that nursery, we call it a culturally appropriate nursery because it took over 3 years to design with a lot of input, and a lot of cultural considerations went into it. It's extremely beautiful. It's made by hand with adobe bricks from soil in the land itself. And we just have been working with DEA over a really long time. I want to say like 3 years, maybe more, to make sure that everything is done with their recommendations, their oversight, their concern, their ongoing checking. So we have, permit numbers and licenses and all of that to do everything that we're doing for this sort of ecosystem level regeneration in the gardens. And and I'll just share too, this is a great example of what it means to just be an ally and be in support and be humble. If you had gone to an academic institution and done a study on how should we regenerate the gardens, they might have said, well, let's put a bunch of big greenhouses up and let's do this and let's do that. But we're actually taking an extremely different approach, which is listening to cultural instructions and Native American guidance about how they want to do things. And I think this is a really important lesson both for philanthropists and other people who want to be in real support. And it's hard when there's lots of excitement and things are moving very fast. But part of the healing relationship and part of being a support is getting behind the cultural components. And because like we said before, those are completely intertwined with the medicine. They're not separate. And so that is what we've been doing. And, and that's, like where that shows up in the fund is that we actually, we initially pulled together a structure to get it started and brought in partners on the ground who we were already familiar with. But now, and it was a 6-month process, actually probably even longer, we've literally passed the organization over to leadership from people on the ground, and they make all the decisions about where the funding goes, which projects are viable. They redid the mission and operating principles based on guidance from the people who are on we call it the conservation committee, based on what their elders wanted to see happen in it. And so it takes a lot of, humbleness. I don't know, Cody, if that's the right word, and patience and commitment to get some of these relationships, I'll just say it, get them right and have them come from a place of respect. And, I think for some people, they would be like, why bother with all of that? But I think this ties back to, I don't know, imagine if 40, 50 years from now, the psychedelic field isn't looking back and going, oh my gosh, we messed this up and we messed that up and we skipped over doing a good job with these relationships, and we forgot to talk about like ethics in therapy, and we forgot to talk about respect for Indigenous partners. And so for me, I definitely think about that. Like, we need to be thinking about the future, and and how we want to have conducted ourselves. So
Mm. Beautiful. It's it's such a complicated scene we're a part of, right? We have to deal with all of this. If you're in biotech, you also have to deal with survival, which is certainly not easy in biotech either. A lot of these companies are going to fail. So, how do we build into the models? Yeah, reciprocity and time. It's going to take a lot of these groups 7 years to come to market with products, right? So there's time there, but is there resources? I don't know. So how do we like get a little collectivized and kind of work towards this?
mm-hmm.
Is that the intention behind the fund that you've developed?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start, and then Cody will probably have more to say about this. But I think that we really see this period of time, this 2, 3, 4, maybe you just said 7, like this period of time. There's a lot changing. Things are moving really quickly. There's a lot of structures that haven't been fully set up. I mean, of course, we're using systems and structures that we already have, but there's a lot that isn't laid down. There's a lot of the narratives that haven't been set. I mean, even when you see like these press flurries that are like high drama, that's a lot about like, we don't know what things are yet. We don't know what's right yet. We don't know. And so there's a way where I feel like things like this fund where you give an offering, and it's actually Indigenous led about how to do support and interface with the field or the movement. These are kind of like our offerings to some structures, some ways of doing things, some narratives that hopefully will help, 7, 8 years from now, those will actually be built in and be a part of things and be normal. If you're in a biotech firm, of course, you're going to support traditional knowledge holders by doing benefit sharing, because why would you not? Because it's about, honoring the history and honoring the future, right? And honoring how you're connected to other parts of, the big community of all of us. So, yeah, I think that we really see this as this kind of, there's a lot of forms that could happen. And, I know for me, I often think about, wow, what forms do I want to contribute to being there? The whole thing isn't going to be perfect. People are going to get hurt. One of our ethics in the fund that was set up by our conservation committee is do no harm. But then all the elders say you hold that as a principle, but some people are going to get harmed. But how can you have it be the least? So I think about that whenever I think that, I could just open a juice bar in Hawaii and hang out.
Well, I think something that Miriam said is really important. Just that I think as a European descendant culture, that we live in a bit of an epidemic of not knowing where we came from. We're not connected to our ceremonies, our traditions, cultural knowings of how to live in the world. And we've done a great job at making things anew, and a lot of incredible ingenuity and progress and creativity. But I think this is a real chance to ensure that these cultures who have held a way of relating to these medicines, these very powerful plant medicines, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, that if we arrive in a psychedelic future 20, 30, 50 years from now, and we haven't done our work to empower those communities to survive and stay strong and stay rooted in their own traditions, we'll be at the same place of not knowing where we came from. What were the original ways of holding these medicines? What were the original songs? What were the original protocols? And once again, we'll have been lost, and that's not healing. That's more disconnection.
Yeah, there's so much here. um, I feel like we should do this more often. But this idea of disconnection and division versus unity and healing, like there, that I believe is a fundamental frame that we kind of have in the psychedelic world. But there's a lot of folks out there kind of making division worse. Like we all want accountability, we all want progress here and improvement, but we've got to be skilled communicators. A little political.
Well, and unity is can be really hard work. And unity isn't about everybody's the same and treat everybody the same and I have the same, it's not about like rights per se. I think sometimes that gets confused with that. There's a lot of nuance in getting to unity and, you know, um, respecting that different people have different responsibilities for different parts and you might have a different responsibility than somebody else. And yeah, I mean there's a lot more to say about unity than that, but that was sometimes I think we get confused about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And
It's
hopefully it makes us all stronger too out of it. I mean, from a high level perspective, and just thinking about, a lot of the challenges, interfacing between decriminalized nature and IPCI. It's been, really fraught, but at the same time, it has elevated the conversation. It's created a little bit of a context for people to be interested in this work where they might not otherwise, or have a platform to really be hearing about it. And it's unfortunate that has to come through controversy and conflict, but I think that's been one of the little silver linings. And
so you do feel like there has been learning. So like some.
I think it's elevating the conversation. People are hearing about it, and even if it's by way of a conflict, they're hearing about the importance of peyote medicine. They're hearing about Native American communities and their use of this medicine, and they're hearing an argument of why it's important to conserve it and perhaps not consume it themselves.
Is there any kind of general guidance? Like I hate to go here, but is there like general guidance for average white American like me? Some people might say I'm not average, but for sake of argument, like what's appropriate from like a typical NAC like point of view or IPCI point of view around like my use of peyote. I've never consumed it. I have zero plans to consume it. I'm curious, but I'm not like um, really super gung ho because of a lot, in particular, the conservation issues and kind of colonial issues.
I mean, I hope this is okay to say, but in my experience, even if it appears from the outside that there's a lot of rigidity in those communities, I found that there is a real deep heart of inclusivity and welcoming, actually. And I think that the real kind of difference is whether or not you're willing to be patient and slow, welcoming yourself and introducing yourself and showing up with a spirit of wanting to support and learn and be receptive and open, and not coming in with strong agendas, and being willing to be sort of made fun of a little bit and poked at, and they're going to test you out a little bit to see if you're genuine. But ultimately, I think there is a deep open heart from what I've experienced. And so I think, just through and through, kind of learning about these cultures and doing the homework, and what they've been through, and what are the conservation issues, and as it comes to peyote, to recognize that there is a very, very real world scarcity of the plant, and importation from Mexico is not an option. So all of it is coming from a small region of Southwest Texas. Most of that land is privately owned and turned into cattle ranch, and so just to keep in mind that this is a very, very precious, very becoming ever more rare, scarce medicine, and really keep that in mind if that comes to be an option for you.
Mm.
Yeah, and I'll say something a little harder line. I would say at this point in history and this point in time, considering what we were just talking about the full tilt, increase in interest and all of that, and also this point in time where we have populations that have really been marginalized, who are engaged in doing their own conservation efforts, utilizing their own strategies and their own methodologies, and having to like change and organize and mobilize around that. That really the respectful thing to do, if you have an interest and you are a person of pretty good privilege with where you live, is to just choose other pathways. You don't need that for your way of life to be intact. And it's okay to give something space and breadth and leave it alone, so that you're not part of creating pressure, either ecologically, culturally, or otherwise. Unless you are really in a position to do support beyond leaving it alone and beyond respecting the IRFA amendments, which were hard won by these people, and it's part of what they have to protect their way of life. And that, unless you really have like something real to offer with no agenda attached, I think leave it alone, and that's fine, because you don't need it for your way of life. It's not, and you don't have an intrinsic responsibility to be involved with it or take care of it or protect it. There's other places you can go for your healing. There's other ways that you can navigate healing, and getting all involved and seeking it out is very likely to cause more harm than you can bring it. And so that's what I would share, actually.
No,
you
I
know
think that's very fair, and yeah, that white cultures, especially on the West Coast, and we're blessed with a paucity of so many amazing medicines, from MDMA and LSD and ayahuasca and 2CB and all the 2Cs and 5-MeO, and just it's incredible. And the Native American communities have, at least in this country, they have peyote. They they do not regard it. It's not a psychedelic. This is a
Mhm.
sacred medicine, sacred plant medicine, and they have no interest. I mean, from all the leadership that we've talked to, absolutely no interest. It would be a sacrilege to consider the other pathways. So they have all they have is peyote.
Mm.
We really need to keep that in mind.
Yeah,
Yeah,
especially
and I
for the
mean,
cultural context. Go ahead.
yeah, I mean, it's important to remember that, like Cody brought up, shit, we don't like to think about it, but these are literally people who, not very long ago, this isn't like the ancient Romans or Greeks or something. It was like not very long ago, land taken away, children taken away, language taken away, treaties broken. And this is what they have. So to me, I feel like it's not even a big conversation. It's not about your cognitive liberty or, something like that. No, it's just about respecting other part. It's like if you're a family and you have somebody in your family that needs something different than you do, you don't try and like force them to be like you, or, it's just, yeah. So I don't know if I explained that very well,
I
but
think you did great. So, the funny thing is there's so much complexity here. We recently had a NAC member living in Oklahoma be a student in our class, and her whole mission was to bring peyote to white cultures. And I met another person recently, NAC Roadman, and he was very explicit. I think there's plenty. I kind of didn't argue with him there, but and was very open about sharing with white people. So like I just want to illustrate how complex and how diverse the opinions are, rather
yeah.
than but the leadership is different from like kind of the younger people, right?
Yeah, and I think you're talking about something really important. And as we know from all different kinds of conservation issues and communicating about them are really complex. And also, you have a cultural paradigm, like Cody said, where there's different kind of laws. There's like spiritual and social laws, and then there's like the laws of the land, and then there's like limits in nature, right? And
Yeah.
all of those are mixing together. And from a spiritual cultural point of view, of course, is for everybody, right? But we're at a particular time in history and in a particular context. So
Yeah. Yeah. Like how long till typically a plant matures, a cactus matures?
you mean, and by mature, what do you mean? Like make seed, or
Uh
is
Allegedly harvestable. Like, I know that's not a really clean answer, right? Because it could be like a 30-year range or something.
yeah, it depends on where they're growing, but like anywhere between 8 and 30 years, and how much it
Right.
rained, and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah. So a long time, desert ecosystems go slow,
Hmm.
and they don't replenish quickly. Like I've been kind of on a rampage around Sonoran desert toad and trying to get people to not use naturally sourced 5-MeO DMT because of the conservation issues, and I receive a lot of pushback.
One of the things that we're funding through the fund is a partnership between Yaqui people and the University of in Mexico City, and also some researchers at the University of Wisconsin, to do a red line study over the next 2.5 years to actually assess populations and population decline, so that there'll be that data about how the toad are actually doing in their native
Beautiful.
habitat. Hmm.
Beautiful. There was I remember a project being spun up a little while ago, Terra Incognita or something, and it was a little too biased of an organization for me to want to get behind it. Because it was like the psychedelic scene, like kind of self-funding a study, or like people strongly identifying with the Bufo scene being leaders of that. I'm like, I don't know, like your agenda is that you want this, so I like don't necessarily trust the organization. So I'm glad to see a project like yours. This is really helpful
Hmm.
because we haven't really had data, and that's like terrifying.
Hmm.
I think it's only like every 10, 20 years that there's some sort of survey done on populations, right, to identify endangered or not, endangered
Right.
status on things. Yeah.
Hmm. Oh.
Mm. When might that project kick off?
It will be initiated this year, and then they're hoping to have data like 18 months from now. It takes time. They have to do, sort of multiple different seasons. They have to go through and all of that. But this is an example of, I think some of the kinds of really exciting, interesting projects that are coming out of really taking indigenous leadership, where for the Yaqui, at least, the toad was, obviously never used for their secretions in that way, but they're a central figure in their creation stories, and they're very much linked to the health of their river and their wetland areas. And so another project that the fund is funding is that there'll be young people in the Yaqui communities putting in ponds and toad habitat, and then also doing education around conservation issues in Yaqui communities, as well as working with the Mexican government to develop a permit program that will actually be administered by the Yaqui for entering the Sonoran Desert in Mexico to collect toad. So they'll actually take on that regulatory responsibility. And so they're being sort of very thoughtful in what their sort of cultural and traditional ways of taking on responsibility for toad conservation are.
Beautiful. Have you ever spoken with Robert Villa from the Tucson Herpetological Society?
I haven't ever had an in-depth conversation, but I
Yeah.
saw him give a talk or something like that one time. Yeah.
Yeah. Great resource on the topic of toad conservation for future reference. So is there any kind of like complexity it would be helpful for people to understand around tribal governments? Or did we maybe already hit that enough?
I don't know. What do you think, Cody? I think, I guess one other thing that I would say on the peyote front is that we have, as part of our federal government, this American Indian Religious Freedom Act and the amendments, which really protect Native Americans' use of this plant. Not as a drug, not as a psychedelic, but as a medicine, and that the AIRFA amendments are actually something that are really important in those communities, and I think worth being really respectful of.
So Miriam, Cody, I'm really curious about if there's anything further you want to say about why it's important to support and be sensitive to these issues around, First Nations peoples in North America. And elsewhere too. There's plenty. I mean, we've talked about Africa as well, so all over really.
I see this as a really interesting opportunity for philanthropy and others who are interested to really create partnerships here. And I think it's remarkable to see the kind of collaboration that's emerged out of this work. That there's a real openness and receptivity to I think working with us and working with Riverstyx, that we have a foot a little bit in both worlds, that we sort of understand the dynamics of what's happening in the psychedelic realm. And so I think the Native American communities are looking for allies, high integrity, trusted allies to be able to navigate this unfolding that's happening, and looking to trusted allies to help guide them on what may be pitfalls and danger points. And I think it's just important to remember that I think we think of Native Americans in the past, of what they were, but to really be aware that this is in the present in a very real way. And though there were traumas in the past, that's playing out now. The average life expectancy of Native Americans in the United States is in the 50s. I mean, could you imagine if all your loved ones, if the average age expectancy, or even your own life, you only expected to live to 50 or so? That would be utterly unacceptable. And as a philanthropist myself, I really scanned the field for years of looking for opportunities to engage Native American populations, to find points of entry, to be able to provide some kind of something to give back, to help. And I think they're just, like you said, that there's so many complexities of trauma and challenges, that this seems again like a very unique opportunity to get behind, again, supporting a medicine that they already rely on for their healing. And a lot of these communities, they're not asking for anything else except, please help us protect our medicine. And what we want most is just to ensure that we have sustainable access to the medicine, and then to be left to pray with it.
I've been doing a lot of driving between Colorado and Phoenix. So I drive through a bunch of Navajo land. And I would encourage people to do that, just to get eyes on what they're resourced with right now in some of these areas. And I feel the guilt regularly, white American guilt, when I see this stuff. I'm like, I played a part in this. My ancestors played a part in this. And this is still the condition these people live in. And it is like, it's not always the case that's happening, but it's just like horrifying when I drive through very deep desert Arizona and I see no running water, minimal infrastructure. It's sad what we've done.
People will point to casinos as being sort of a counter to that, but from what I understand, and Miriam can say more, but that's a very small number of individuals, and it's not shared in the communities, that wealth, and it's funneled to certain places. So I think it's another area that I think blocks people from being more open and compassionate, and aware of the struggles there.
Yeah. And I hope I'm not being insulting by speaking about it that way, but it's just like that land is, very different from where they were living before. And it's just really, really sad to see. So, getting firsthand example, encountering First Nation peoples and, getting to know them. And you're spot on. Like, the use of language is so interestingly different and fascinating. So I encourage people, when they have the opportunity, have some respectful conversation. It's so interesting. It's such a different frame. This is how we pray, like peyote use as pray, like a prayer. I think you said that earlier. And that's, such an interesting frame and beautiful.
And that's, that was really built into the origins of the Native American church, that it was really this unifying sort of container that hadn't really existed before. That in the Native American church, a lot of the songs are not, they're not based on any one tribe's language. They're more tonal, and that there's a universal sort of shared understanding of this form that that really transcends any one tribe, and that's really brought together and empowered a lot of the tribes to have this sort of shared way of praying. And so I just find it completely beautiful and awe-inspiring to be, even in a board meeting and hear Dene Navajo being spoken, and Lakota and Cheyenne, and all these different languages coming together. It's like it's a United Nations, truly.
Mm.
Well, something else that I'd love to share that we were thinking about a couple of years ago is, how they have sustainable fisheries guides, that one of the things that would be really helpful in, the kind of growing psychedelic space and interest would be kind of like something like a sustainable fisheries guide, like how to make ecologically and culturally appropriate choices, and consider sustainability, and consider ecological impact, and consider cultural impact. And so we haven't really done that exactly, but part of the fund is actually kind of an app that will give people a chance to give directly to some of these biocultures and kind of highlight some of the sustainability issues. It's called Grow Medicine, but that's actually, it was an idea that there's a woman in the space had out of a master's thesis, and then we had some conversations with her, and she decided that she would, sort of relinquish, being the founder, and we would have it be a project of the fund. And so everything that's in that app is now actually directed by the conservation committee. So it's been really fascinating, just this back and forth process of developing kind of a really, kind of like friendly to the everyday regular lay person enthusiast, but bring a lot of information in and help support people to make choices and be engaged in benefit sharing, even though they're not like a philanthropist or a company owner or something, but just like somebody who's interested in. So I think we're really excited about that, because I think it will help bring some of these narratives and understandings and forward. And what can be the cultural impact if you just go tromping right into something, or what can be the ecological impact if, even though iboga could really help your family member with this substance abuse, what's the ecological impact? What are some of the other options? What are the stories? And so that's something that's a project of the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund that we're excited about and hoping will help, just kind of bring this conversation into play. Because I think when you start talking about it, anything below just like a really surface level, most people really care about other people and other communities, and who is going to be able to be in their homes in the future and have their way of life in the future. People just care. We naturally care about each other and each other's health, and it's when we don't quite have enough information, or we haven't given ourselves a chance to think about it, or we're in that mode of like, well, I have to get my need met and there isn't other ways to do it, that we forget about caring about other communities and their diversity, and them having their own identities and all of that.
Mm-hmm. Miriam, how many different tribal interest groups do you work with at IPCI?
Oh, IPCI. Um, well, there's in Mexico, there's just one group that we're working with directly. In the United States and Canada, there's over 45. Sometimes the number's more around 60, but over 200 to 250,000 members. It's unclear. And of course, IPCI is a conservation organization. It's not like a Native American church or a religious organization. It's a conservation organization that's mission is to do supportive work so that the churches can continue and be around for a long time to come. And then in the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund, in our first suite, we have, I think, 24 projects on the ground in 7 countries. And then in another year and a half or so, there'll be another suite of projects that come online. And so that's a lot of different communities.
Mm. It's amazing. Yeah, that's such a great broad coalition.
Mm-hmm.
And I really advise folks go back and listen to the podcast we did ages ago. And that was a really good one. And Cody, same with your podcast we did. It was incredible. Are there any particular media pieces you'd like to maybe point folks towards to learn more?
I mean, one that stands out, if folks haven't read Michael Pollan's latest book, This Is Your Mind on Plants. His 3rd chapter is on mescaline, and largely features the work of IPCI and some of its Indigenous board leadership. And I think he just does a beautiful job really characterizing the importance of peyote in the history of the Native American church and for Native communities. So I would definitely start there for sure.
Beautiful. And what websites do you want to shout out or point people towards?
Well, we have IPCI.life, and we have IMC.fund, which will go live in about 2 weeks. Mm-hmm.
Amazing. And by the time it's out, it's public. This podcast will come out probably a few weeks later. So folks, go check it out.
And of course, people look at our Riverstyx Foundation website, which Cody is the web designer of. And it has a lot of really good information on it.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. This has been incredible, and I hope we can do it again. And maybe, in about a year or less this time around.
That'd be great. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Joe.